to the last PIER public seminar for this semester. This session is being recorded, so please keep that in mind as you ask questions. Your questions could have a life on YouTube later, I suppose. No, I don't think that's happened, but just to be conscious of it. To start, I just want to share some expectations for the event. I'd encourage you to ask clarifying questions, throughout the presentation, but please save sort of big picture, in-depth questions to the end when we could have a broader discussion of them. If you're participating via Zoom, use the hand raising function, and I'll try to moderate the questions in case Sidney is speaking and doesn't have a chance to see you raise your hand. If you're viewing via YouTube, submit your questions on Twitter using the hashtag PIER seminar, PIER seminar, or email PIER_fellowship@gse.harvard.edu. And Ashley, who is helping to run this seminar, will put those in the chat. Now, I just wanted to extend a warm welcome to Sidney DeMello, who's speaking today. Sidney is a professor at the Institute of Cognitive Science and the Department of Computer Science at University of Colorado, Boulder. He leads the NSF, National Institute on Student Agent Teaming, which aims to develop AI technologies to facilitate collaborative learning experiences for students. His team is interested in the dynamic interplay between cognition and emotion, while individuals and groups engage in complex real-world tasks. Their research uses a range of techniques such as eye tracking, speech recognition, physiological sensing, computer vision, discourse modeling, and machine learning to study interaction in the context of educational games or collaborative problem solving, classroom discourse, and the workplace. So Sidney's going to be talking today about machine learned computational models. We're grateful that Sidney was able to join us today. So Sidney, take it away.
Well, thank you, Tom, and thanks everybody. Let me just also thank you, Ashley, for scheduling everything and helping out throughout this week and today. Really fun to meet with the students. I really enjoyed your questions and conversations. And I look forward to touching base after this talk. And good to see some friends in the audience. Hi, Chris and David and folks. Wish we could be hanging out in person next time, and Todd, and we just had a great meeting. So let me just dive in by sharing my screen. So let's see if this works. Is that looking decent?
Yes.
Okay, great. So I'll just dive in. The title of this talk is Understanding Human Functioning and Enhancing Human Potential through Computational Methods. And just to kind of give you a flavor of kind of where I'm coming from, or where we're coming from, our team, we're really interested in essentially how people kind of think and feel broadly. So I've been thinking about many representations to kind of summarize what we do, and this is the latest. It's not the greatest. I'm still working on it, but this is what I call the pyramid scheme diagram. But essentially, we're kind of interested in this focus on cognition, emotion, and social interaction. we started out looking at cognition, and then we realized, wow, we can't understand cognition if you don't understand emotion. And then life is about social interaction. So we started to look at these things in the context of collaboration and things. So these are the phenomena that motivate us when individuals and groups are kind of engaging in real world tasks. A second pillar of my training that I really value is this idea of looking at things through multiple contexts and with a mindset that we maybe call it, you can call it scientific pluralism, where any method that is needed to answer the question is an acceptable method. So looking at how people interact in the lab, online, at school, at home, using a variety, and even the workplace, looking at experimental methods, observations, qualitative, you name it. A key piece to connect these up, which I'll focus on today, is number 3, which is this idea of multimodal, multi-party, multi-scale sensing. People are really complex, and behavior and cognition and emotion are complex, and they emerge at multiple levels over different time periods. And to piece those together, to try to understand what is actually happening, and I'll hopefully show you some examples, we look at a range of techniques as listed there. We find that computational models, or a certain type of model I want to talk about today, can really serve as this bridge between some of the more experimental psychological science work we do and some of the more engineering and applied work we do. So I want to argue for these models as kind of being this connective tissue and really helping for more from application perspectives, but also helping us really understand really complex phenomena. And even if not helping us understand complex phenomena, helping us learn how to understand complex phenomena. So this will be clear in a second. And finally, my advisor in grad school always told me that it's good to produce more than paper. And so we've always also had this kind of engineering mindset where we try to take what we learn and the models or whatever and build some things, some technologies, small scale proof of concept, increasingly scaling up, that really try to help people achieve better or achieve to their full potential by kind of coordinating thinking and feeling with knowledge and action. So I'll try to illustrate these different points today as much as possible. So we've been at this, for a few years, and this is kind of really dating myself here, but I really got interested in these questions since 2002. And these are some of the areas we've kind of worked in. And we started out very much doing work and more abstract theoretical work in the lab, but we've really been branching out over the last 10 years or so, doing things more in the wild, and classrooms is the context I'll speak about today. So just some central claims. So the study of cognition, emotion, and social interaction has obviously greatly benefited from really rigorous work in observational work, experimental work, detailed analytical approaches, think alouds, coding and counting, high quality instrumentation, and what I like to call traditional computational models. I'll touch on this a little more, but when you have well-defined phenomena, it's that you can actually model it. But what happens is in many of the phenomena we are interested in, we feel that it's a little too early to sketch out detailed mechanistic models. And so we turn to a type of model that I'm tentatively calling machine-learned computational models. And these are essentially when we just don't have an adequate theoretical or mechanistic account. One of the examples I'll talk about today is we were interested in mind wandering, when people zone out. And we did not even, it's even hard to measure when that's occurring. And then what are the causes of mind wandering? What is happening in the brain? These are questions that'll take decades to answer. So these kinds of models, I would argue, can help us understand some of those questions and help us facilitate the scientific discovery rather quickly. Sometimes the data is just too complex and there's just too much happening. A good example of this, I was speaking to some earlier, is understanding vocal communication of emotion. It really gets through deep interactions of your vocal tract, and there's so many degrees of freedom to be able to model that in a very well-defined mechanism or theory is quite overwhelming. So can data and these approaches help? I think with some caveats, the models themselves can help you understand something about the underlying phenomena, knowing fully well it's not a substitute for a detailed theory. It never will be. So what can you learn understanding that you have limited understandings of causality and things like that? So importantly, a model is a physical thing or a computational thing that you can do things with. So you can actually embed them in interventions, you can use them for reflection. And now you suddenly have gone from abstract measurement, abstract kind of conceptualizations to a tool that can actually be used. But I would argue that there's a lot of computational models out there in computer science that some of them have limited validity or uses in some of the more psychological sciences, because sometimes the phenomena is not studied in ecological valid context, so the phenomena are not ecologically valid. And you can do something in the lab. It doesn't always have to be in the wild, measuring things out there. But what is the nature of the task and what you're studying is something important to keep in mind. And this is kind of a controversial claim here, but I think it's important to be grounded in theory, but not be overly constrained when you don't have the theories. We just don't have the detailed theories that are validated sufficiently to construct these models. But at the same time, you don't want to be inconsistent with what we know and just get on a massive data mining fishing expedition. So if navigated correctly, I would argue that these kinds of approaches can be helpful. So I'll try to demonstrate that with some examples today. So very quickly, what do I mean by a machine learned computational model? I shared this recent paper and we had to put these together, but really a model is essentially three things. You have a structure. It could be a set of rules. Think about a regression model. That's the equation is the structure. It has parameters. Those are your parameters. And you have features. What goes into the regression equation, right? Age and prior knowledge, SES, and so on. So the traditional models are handcrafted. This is constructed by hand. There's really good explanation. This is the classic model from the human performance, GOMS. It was very popular in the 70s. These are wonderful. They take a long time to construct, but if you know the theory, if you have a good mechanistic account, it works great. Then you have these more traditional psychological models. In this case, kind of the structure is pretty much specified, but you kind of learn, and the features, what goes in the models are specified, but you learn the parameters. So you're kind of learning the parameters. And these are big generalizations. On the other hand, we get into this idea of these machine learned models. What happens there is in a standard machine learning approach, you don't really know the structure. I don't know how to put these variables together. And I may not even know what the parameters are, but I do know what my descriptives are. So I do know that, for example, if I'm trying to investigate the facial expressions of confusion, which is some work we did, my key variables are the brow, the tip of the nose, how it's raised, the pulling of the lip. So I have my variables, I just don't know how they come together. To get those to come together, I turn to human knowledge, such as a human telling me, this is an example of confusion. This is not an example of confusion. This is contempt, but not confusion. And you fuse those both to kind of learn the model. So you're substituting the actual human engineering that comes from decades of knowledge and experience with data and with some human signal. So that's the key difference. And the latest models, which take it a step even further, they don't even need the feature representations. They will just take images of the face and some labels that these are confused or not, or maybe even not, and try to essentially learn the features, the parameters, and the structures. So I'm mainly going to speak about this here, because this is where it's possible to actually strike some good, decent balances between not being overly constrained by theory, but not just being totally kind of open-ended and atheoretical. And these models go from explanatory models to these very much predictive models. And again, you can blend them both. So if you know something, for example, models of the some of the models from cognitive neuroscience, you may know that certain pathways are not feasible. So you can turn those neurons off, you can turn those connections off. So it's possible to blend these all together. These are just the big picture things. So these types of models are actually quite popular. And turning back to Newell's kind of classic analysis of his bands of cognition, we just mapped out some examples of research in the different areas of psychological science. So you can see they really are kind of all over the place. So that's kind of good to see. And some of the studies are really large. So here's an example of a pretty decent study where they tried to, from our university, my colleague Tor, who's now at Dartmouth, they really tried to figure out what are the neural signatures of pain and that are specific to a certain type of pain and not other types of pain, and so on and so forth. And they had some really interesting models of that. So I want to talk to you today, time permitting, of about 4 examples. It doesn't matter if I don't get to all of them. I'm really starting with very, very fine-grained, one human, very controlled, one human, one text, and kind of the dance of the human and the text, as you can see by looking at eye movements. So in reading. Whenever I talk about this, people think about reading as the most boring phenomena. And I used to think that, but it's actually one of the most interesting phenomena because what a person brings to the text and what a text offers to the reader and what the context of the text and the context in which the text and the reader exist in just leads to these most amazing interactions and dynamics. But then let's take a step further and get into something more in the wild, looking at trying to analyze teacher discourse using just audio signals. So how can we make sense of what teachers are saying in actual classrooms just from audio? And then I'll talk about, so the first one is kind of one-on-one, and then here you have one-on-many, a teacher and many students. And then the nice blend, what we've been really interested in is this kind of multimodal, multi-party, collaborative discourse. These are actually 3 of my grad students who are interacting in this kind of fun game. And you really have interesting kind of dynamics that emerge here. And lastly, as Tom mentioned, I'm directing one of the national NSF AI Institutes for Student AI Teaming, which we are just in our 2nd year. And I'll just share with you more or less our vision and where we're going. So we don't really have much there yet. The whole year has been getting us to kind of learn how to work together and build shared understanding. Okay. So the first project, this goes way back from teams. A lot of people have contributed to this. So kind of done a lot of the work from Notre Dame all the way now to CU Boulder. And we were really just interested in eye movements during reading. And by the way, this is what it looks like when you actually, if you look at somebody reading, you may notice that that a lot of words are skipped. Eye movements typically do follow a pretty standard pattern, but then you have what's called a regressive eye movement that goes back. They're quite chaotic. And the most interesting thing is it's almost a miracle that you're constructing a representation of a text just from these few samples of what you're sampling in there. And what are the processes by which that occurs is really been fascinating and for many of us. But we focused on a phenomena that occurs quite commonly during reading, and that's mind wandering. So when you're learning, this occurs when you're reading something and you have no idea what you just read, or you may be watching a film, or during this talk, you may just zone out and don't feel bad. It's a very, very natural response, an adaptive response. But in the case of learning, we did a meta-analysis, just a mini informal meta-analysis of studies we've done in our own lab. And we actually found that like 30% of the time this occurs. It's about 30% of the time during reading. In watching videos of classroom videos, it could go up to 50%. If there's some kind of engaging interaction, it can be as little as 15%, but very rarely between those. And it negatively correlates with learning. This is not to say that all mind wandering is bad and we need to be attention police. But in the case of learning, there's a degree in which it might warrant some corrective action, or if anything, just measuring the ability to sustain attention can be informative. So we spent a lot of time thinking about and building a theory of why people mind wander, and supporting that with a lot of data. But the general idea, very quickly, is that you're constantly in this competition, rather, for consciousness. Conscious access is a serial resource. The brain is operating in parallel, but conscious access is serial to give stability to the world. And there's this competition between these thoughts that are what we call comprehension congruent thoughts, trying to understand a text, trying to understand my speech, trying to understand a narrative, and all these other things that are trying to also get to the seat of consciousness. Fantasies, things you're worried about, so on and so forth. Mind wandering occurs when, by some mechanism of executive failure, these incongruent thoughts grab consciousness and they pop into your mind, and we can realize those, right? And that leads to this idea of what we call perceptual and cognitive decoupling, where you literally are looking at the text and looking at the words, but nothing is being encoded perceptually and also cognitively. And because of that, your model or your representation is disrupted. The amazing thing about this that I find the most fascinating is, in the case of lab studies that are typically done, you actually find, which are done with no content. You find, they're done with lab tasks, they don't have any information. You get one pattern of results. With the case of reading and learning, the stimulus itself is a source of mind wandering because it's semantically relevant. There's meaning there. I'm reading about the beach and I think about my last summer vacation, and boom, I'm sort of off on a trajectory. I want to clarify that we define this very precisely. If you're learning something and you're reflecting or elaborating on something that goes beyond the text or your material, that is not mind wandering. That is exactly the kinds of elaborative processes we want. We define it as mind wandering and categorize it when it's just really off task or completely unrelated. And admittedly, that distinction is not that clear cut. So here's one of my favorite studies, just to illustrate one of those. We had people read this book on soap bubbles. It's about surface tension in liquids. It was rated the second most boring book on the internet. I actually like it. It's this guy's giving some lectures with some experiments on from like 150 years ago. And we had people watch this film, The Red Balloon, which is, it won an Oscar in 54. It's used in a lot of narrative studies because it's got minimalistic dialogue. This balloon has a life of its own, and this is what it looked like. And as people are either reading for 20 minutes and then they watch the movie, whenever they catch themselves mind wandering, is what we call self-caught mind wandering. They just hit a key. And in this study, we actually asked them to tell us the content of their thoughts. And you can actually do this. This introspection works, in this case, for the most part, because mind wandering is a conscious phenomena. It's very tricky in other kind of psychological processes. And, and we would just analyze what they were doing. And, here's an example. They were reading about the word the Louvre, which triggered, the actual memory. Haha, last time I was in the Louvre, I threw up in front of the Mona Lisa. And, and then a reflection. I wonder how strange the people looking at this data will think I am, and so on and so forth. But what you really see here is a thought train. You see this word that triggers a memory that actually triggers something, and then this whole chain goes on and you've zoned out. And we were able to do all kinds of analyses to understand the type of zone outs that occur. And in the case of semantic content, many times it's the stimulus itself. So one challenge is that mind wandering is actually really hard to pick up. Can you measure it? Typically we use self-reports where we either have people tell us when they zone out or they hit a key, and then you give them or there's a thought probe, pseudo-random probes. Are you zoning out now or not? But let me show you some examples. Here's an example. This is 10 seconds before they responded, whether they zoned out or not. And let me know what you think. In a second, they're like shockingly inaccurate, but they're above chance. And so we turn into eye movements. And here's here's my student Megan's. This is a high fidelity eye tracker. Doesn't have to be this sophisticated. We do a lot of things with simpler ones. But here's an example of some eye tracking in that movie of a participant. And you can see the green dot is where she's looking. And here this is called a smooth pursuit movement because she's following an object. And as you notice, the signal is really noisy. So in this case, you're not even getting eye movements because she's covering her eyes, and so on. And a couple of kind of fascinating things about eye movements is one, what we're actually constructing from the scene is a total illusion. What we're actually sampling are these little green dots. And it's almost like a miracle that we're able to construct a whole narrative around this boy and his balloon based on what we're sampling. And the second thing that's interesting is there's this concept called the tyranny of film. They have manipulated our attention so much in these films that when we actually study participants, you'd expect to get variability in eye movements. You almost get nothing, because everybody just follows the ball and follows what's going on. It's just so well crafted. And in fact, you get much more interesting dynamics in text. So we built a model to try to predict if somebody's mind wandering or not, based on the eye movements during reading. And actually, it turned out to be pretty decent. So what you see on the top, so this is like an example of the things we would look at. We would look at where they were, how often they were fixating, how big were the fixation durations, how many fixations, just very simple kind of what we call global eye movement features. And here's it compared to self-reported mind wandering. So the model is decent. And in all of this work, when I say decent, I mean not terrible, because it's really, the precisions get really tricky. In this case, I would say the correlation was about 0.4 with self-reported mind wandering. So we said, okay, well, that's cool. What can we do with this model? Well, there's two important things you can do. One of the most biggest questions is, when do you start mind wandering? Nobody can tell, so nobody knows. So you can run the model live, and you can actually look at the model's predictions on a second-by-second basis to then be able to detect the length of a mind-wandering episode. And by doing that, we've estimated it to be about 10 to 15 milliseconds. So that's a kind of an example of being able to use this model to kind of resolve a long-standing kind of scientific question, and not resolve, produce a piece of data. But on the other hand, here's kind of how we did it to improve kind of the reading intervention. So typically people are reading this text page by page, and they move on, right? So what we did here is, when they go from page 1 to 2, we grab their eye gaze, run it through the model I just showed you, and then if it says, no, you're not mind wandering, we kind of let them move on. If it detects that they're mind wandering, then it will actually ask them a question on the page they just read. And the idea is, and then if they answer correctly, we allow them to like continue reading. If they answer incorrectly, they're given an opportunity to reread and correct their comprehension deficiency, and we just reassess them, and then regardless, they can move on. So two things are happening here. One is, the idea is that if you're zoned out, let's try to see if we can regain your attention by asking that question. And second, if you do have a comprehension deficiency, let's correct it, because the fear is that if you're not encoding information of the text, this cascades through, because now your mental representation is weak, which means you're less likely to integrate subsequent text, and that actually leads to more mind wandering. So there's this vicious cycle. So in actually implementing the HCI gets a little trickier, and we found out two big problems with this intervention. One, the questions were these factual questions focusing on a page that actually caused people to change their whole reading behaviors. Rather than trying to read the text, they tried to guess our questions and were skimming around. So it was literally the exact opposite effect than what we wanted. So in a subsequent intervention, it's been changed. What we do now is we chunk the text based on certain concepts. We look at like 3 concepts at a time, get an aggregate of their mind wandering, and instead of asking a multiple choice question, we would ask self-explanation questions. So what was the point that the author was trying to make in this? They construct type responses, which are scored automatically, and then the same intervention proceeds. So we did a really small evaluation in the lab on this. Basically, we basically compared this intervention that's responding to mind wandering with the yoked control. So one of the things is that self-explanations are one of the most effective learning strategies by itself. So what we did was, the way this is yoked is, if I got the interventions on pages 2, 7, and 9 based on my mind wandering, my yoked participant in the control group would also get it on 2, 7, and 9, but independent of their mind wandering. So the idea is that you're getting the exact same treatment, but it's not sensitive to their kind of mental state as predicted by the model. And we assessed comprehension immediately after reading and a week later, and rote level, what we call text-based comprehension, factual information, and more inference level comprehension, which is like more detailed, more like deeper comprehension. No effects for immediate comprehension, kind of some weak effects, moderate effects actually, small to medium effects in favor of this dynamic responses to mind wandering after a week-long delay when these memory consolidation processes and all have occurred. So that was super exciting, but that was all done in the lab with a super expensive eye tracker. And since then, we've been taking this line of work into classrooms. This is in a classroom in northern Indiana, where we swapped out those expensive lab eye trackers for this absolutely wonderful eye tracker, which unfortunately is no longer available because Apple has acquired them. But this is in the context of a biology class, and these little eye trackers up here, and we did a lot of work so that the students themselves are calibrating the eye trackers so you don't have researchers. We basically wanted to see can you actually get high quality eye gaze in this classroom environment and do something with it. And it turns out we actually were able to get pretty good eye tracking data. And in this case, students were interacting, other than reading, with this intelligent tutoring system based on expert human tutors I worked on when I was in grad school. And it's pretty cool, but you may notice that we actually got, this is very prototypical gaze patterns. A lot of gaze is concentrated on the tip of the nose. You always see that there. And this is for biology. And kind of the main findings were being able to do eye tracking in mass kind of in a school environment with pretty much consumer grade eye tracking. And we actually did the same thing. We developed a model of mind wandering as students were interacting with this tutor. And in this case, when they detected that the student was mind wandering, she would either ask a question or say their name, you know, like Tom, what do you think about the enzyme's role, and so on and so forth. And the idea was to kind of get their attention back and have them focus on the content. And very lastly, you can also, eye tracking is still a problem with an eye tracker to put in classrooms. You can actually do stuff with just cameras. So this is my student Nigel, who's an assistant professor now at UIUC, his dissertation work, where we basically try to encode facial information in different ways. You can just look at body movement. You can look at kind of facial expressions. You can look at facial textures, like how the texture of the face is occurring at these key points and other things. And what was cool is we were able to just pick out mind wandering from these videos without any eye tracker at levels that kind of not outperformed, but tied with humans. So we did a study where we showed the same videos I showed you to 9 humans and got their judgments versus the kind of the computer model. And the kind of interesting finding was it took about 3 humans, the aggregate of 3 human judgments, to tie with the computer. Of course, none of them are actually very good, but they're all above chance. So, you know, so there's some potential here to being able to scale up these technologies without having to rely on kind of expensive intrusive equipment. And just turning back to reading, one thing we're very excited about now is a project we're running right now is what we found is that you can only go so far with eye movements. They can tell you a lot, but there's a lot of internal mental processing that occurs that you just cannot get out of eye movements. And an example is when people detect that they've got a comprehension deficiency, they can either do what's called a regressive eye movement, where they go back to the previous part of text, and you can pick that up. But other times they just try to resolve it in their own mind. So they just have a long fixation and something is happening. They're resolving it in working memory. And so we're trying to see if we can pick out some of those signals. This is an FNIRS device. It's kind of basically doing scanning a little bit above cortex, but outside of the lab. And it's kind of a way to get blood flow in the brain. And there's also some EEG there. This is Rosie, she's an EEG expert. So we're trying to be able to look at eye tracking coupled with these neurophysiological measurements to say, hey, I think something interesting is happening in the eyes. What's kind of going on in the mind? And can we couple those together? So I can take a brief pause here if there's any questions before I kind of move on. Tom, if there's any clarification questions.
Folks have questions so far? Todd.
I have one. This stuff is really cool, Sidney. Is mind wandering correlated with inaccuracy in answering the questions? When in 2 studies back, when you were only turning the page, it seems like that's a first order question. I assume that you tested. Is your detection of mind wandering correlated with actual comprehension? Because I could imagine a story where we drift once we think we've got it. But
fascinating question. Actually, the correlation between mind wandering as self-reported and comprehension in one of these data sets was -0.2. But actually with the model that's predicting mind wandering and comprehension was even stronger. It was -0.4. And we have two explanations for that. We think it was, one is that the eye movements could be picking up things that are more than mind wandering. So that's one. But secondly, a lot of mind wandering occurs what we call without meta awareness, outside of people's awareness. So there could be mind wandering as not being reflected in the self-reports that the computer model could be picking up. Any others, or should I move on? Or
Why don't you move on?
okay.
I'm
So
sure. Yeah,
okay,
people
great.
have-
So let me just turn over a little bit and talk a little bit about kind of a different angle to this is a question of kind of automatic feedback on teacher discourse. And this is work with, we started with Marty Nystrom, who did a lot of work on question asking in ELA classrooms, and Sean Kelly, my colleague, and Andrew and folks. We were, we all, a lot of us are educators and teachers in some sense, and this was very personal to me, when I started teaching at tenure track, and I, at Notre Dame, and realizing that, wow, I have no feedback. And the feedback I did get was maybe once a semester, focused on a pure observation on days that I chose. And then the debriefing would always be focused on how do you get better student ratings, right? And less on what are you doing that makes you a more effective teacher. And so this is when, and I don't need to belabor this point to this group, but as we know that, one of our Anders Ericsson, who studied deliberate practice and who recently actually passed away last year, he had his theory of practice on what makes expertise. And the basic idea is that when you think about regular practice, people develop rapidly at first, and then they may plateau. But deliberative practice is a type of practice that occurs with a coach, with reflection. It's very strategic, and you can help develop in a different way. And some of the challenges that occur in teacher learning is that there's a lot of performances, but very, very rare opportunities to practice where there's feedback and there's guidance. The feedback is usually evaluative, not formative. It's infrequent. And it's also known that reflecting through memory itself without having anything to guide the reflection on your practice is not the most effective thing. And rarely is the practice contextualized in what they call job embedding professional development, right, in models of PD. So we thought about, two things. One is, can we actually measure some aspects of teacher discourse in a way that can be automated to help give teachers feedback, but also maybe serve as a research tool? And so it kind of looks like this in a very simplified form. Teachers are doing their thing. We record audio. And the idea, though, was to figure out how to do this fully automatically. And that took a lot of work to figure out how to set up microphones to record classrooms in a way. Then there's some speech analysis, some computational modeling, and then some feedback. And the point was, how do you set this all up so it's automatic and can be useful? So we typically approach these problems. We will set up a computer lab that has great sensors and great everything. And then we go into the wild and you basically throw all that out and start from zero. So we said, let's not do it that way. Let's just get into the wild and figure things out. And this is back in 2013, where we were trying to see how can we record classroom audio. So we wanted it to be cost effective. We wanted to be districts or schools to be able to at least afford equipment that could be used. It had to be scalable to different classroom configurations. Every classroom is structured differently. Teachers had to be able to use it themselves. And there were concerns about privacy and security about the data, because you are recording classroom observations. And lastly, we wanted to generalize. And of course, this is a moving target. It's hard to get generalizability, given dialect variations and all kinds of things. But we wanted to generalize at least across different people. So if you just record, and Tom, if you can hear the audio, just give me a thumbs up.
All right. What are some big risks that you have taken? You don't mind sharing.
This is my job.
So if you just stick a microphone in a classroom, you'll get something like that, which is very comprehensible to humans. But at the time, the computer speech recognizers could do nothing with this. They're a little better now. So we had to really figure out how to get high quality audio, and playing around with a lot of microphones, we kind of settled on this initial configuration. So the teachers wear this mic. It's amazing. It's really great. It's a little cumbersome now given the form factor. And then this is what's called a pressure zone amplitude microphone. This is like used to record choirs and stuff. You basically mount it on a board, and you put it on the below the whiteboard, and then the whole wall kind of becomes a receptive surface. So you can like record the whole classroom. So the idea was to get, and they're mixed together right here. So the idea was to get really high quality teacher audio and mediocre quality classroom audio of student and teacher discourse. So the main goal was to be able to do speech recognition with this just to get some audio patterns. And here's what the audio may look like. So you get this high quality teacher signal and this intermediate quality classroom signal. So let me just play you the teacher signal.
The time and place in which a story takes place.
And that's pretty good for a real classroom. Here's the case with
there. Got it.
Why? What did you do?
Braxton, you're working, not talking.
So you notice that once she started speaking, the active kind of noise cancellation turned out some of that audio playing. So and this is what this mic picks up.
Yeah, his name's Darian. Hey.
Hey, what's the word? The utopia. The utopia could lead to a dystopia because something could go wrong. Okay. Like something they made could go horribly wrong and create a dystopia such as a dream turning into a nightmare.
So it's decent audio. It's not as good as the teacher speech. So anyway, so we collected a bunch of data. This is our first data collection. We've doubled that now. And we looked at the following discourse categories very quickly. Whether it was a statement or a question, different types of questions. Is it an authentic question, a question that doesn't have a pre-scripted response, and so on and so forth. And the idea then was to, these are hand-coded by humans, so every utterance is hand-coded, whether it's in evidence or one of these items and all that good stuff. And then the question was, can you look at the language to replicate what the humans are coding? We looked at over the years, a couple of different techniques to do this. The kind of traditional technique is you basically take the data, get your transcripts, and you can actually just look at words like this, like unigrams. What are the words? Bigrams, groups of words, and so on. And you could just learn a model to do that. But more lately, the later techniques, what they do is they actually start with models that are pre-trained on a lot of world knowledge. And what these models do is they learn what's called contextual semantics. What is the meaning of a word in context? And so, for example, the word bank could mean riverbank, or it could mean financial institution. So based on the context of the words around it, the meaning of a word lies in the company it keeps. It can disambiguate those. So we just tried out these different things. And here's kind of a result of modeling authenticity. This is the computer model versus the human. And the computer model is a little more peakier, but overall, it's a decent model. And the correlation was pretty good. And here are kind of our latest correlations for these different variables compared to expert human codes. So, I would say these are moderate to decent for a fact that it's a microphone picking something up and everything is fully automatic. But there's, of course, room for improvement. So we've actually been working on an app that gives feedback to teachers based on the audio recorded. So this is kind of what it looks like. They log in to look at the classes. They may choose a class, and we've chosen some discourse variables. If they click on one, this was a really difficult decision as to how to give them feedback. Everybody wants the numbers, but we were uncomfortable with the degrees of accuracies to actually give them the actual numbers. So we convert them to these, these percentiles, and we gave them feedback like that, along with explanations and very, very clear information on the accuracy of the system. So we wanted to be really transparent with the teachers. And then the more important thing was these summaries that over multiple lessons would basically say for example, out of your open-ended questions, which are authentic questions, 67% of your lessons were medium and 33% were kind of really good. And the idea was, the main idea of this app, without any other intervention, was to promote these kinds of noticings of discourse and hopefully cue attention into some of these strategies. So this was all ready to be kind of user tested last fall, and then COVID happened. But we're actually conducting studies literally now with a small sample of teachers where they record 3 lessons, and then they use the app over like another 5 lessons, and we do interviews just to see if there's any changes in behaviors and things like that. So we're pretty excited to kind of finally be able to like close this loop out to see what occurs. So that's just an example of being able to take a model train it on analyzing discourse, and then kind of use it back again to kind of see if you can affect any change in behavior. So I think I'll skip this in the interest of time. Very quickly, we've also looked at collaboration and have developed models that look at collaborative discourse. But I'll just skip it and move on to kind of my last topic I want to talk about and leave some time for discussion, is talking about the Institute for Student AI Teaming. So this is one of the NSF's kind of national AI institutes. Last year, 2 years ago, they funded 5 institutes. These are like 5-year deals. Last year, they funded 11 more. And this year, they have a 3rd call. So they're really putting in a lot of resources to this. They have different themes. Our institute was on AI in education. And thus far, they've funded 3 of these institutes and have a call for a 4th one. So we've got a wonderful team of folks here. These are kind of faculty and our research partners and students and postdocs. And we're just starting our 2nd year. So it's been super fun launching all of this in the pandemic, but we're doing, it's been really great experience too. So to think about what our idea was, many years ago, Ken was invited to do this review article, and I joined him. And we looked at educational data mining and what's kind of out there. And he made this really nice diagram of the different psychological constructs, cognition to social emotion, and the different data sources, and to kind of reflect on where the work has been in emphasizing using data mining and modeling in education. And we listed a few kind of, I guess, key things like work on essay grading is a big one, cognitive modeling, and so on. But one thing you may notice is that almost everything here was very much one-on-one interactions. It's a computer and a student. There was very little other social things, with one exception being work on collaboration by Caroline Rose at folks. And the other thing was everything was domain specific. So for example, the models used in essay grading, focusing on essay grading, had no relation to what's going on in learning math with Cognitive Tutor. And we are thinking about if you think about a more holistic school system, we actually thought about a couple of opportunities here. One is this idea of enhancing the bandwidth of communication. So and by the way, these are not the only opportunities. There are many more. These are the ones we identified. Basically enhancing the bandwidth from one student and one teacher to this idea of multimodal, multi-party, naturalistic social interactions. And these are kind of been research themes for us for a while. So what is the interaction between students, teachers, and AI together? The other idea was thinking about developing the whole student, whatever that may mean, but it basically means while you're promoting these content knowledge, thinking about 21st century skills like collaboration, like creative thinking, like computational thinking, along with some ideas of character building, persistence, and so on and so forth. So how can we develop materials that really broaden, have multiple learning goals? And lastly, this idea of reimagining ethical and equitable AI. So for many years, the idea was we don't have to worry about this. We develop our technologies, they'll be used later, and we'll sort that out later. But what we've learned recently, and from kind of some of the things that have occurred in big tech and so on, that's just not viable anymore. And this is an opportunity for us to really take a hard and critical look at AI in classrooms from the ground up. Starting with the question, do we need AI in classrooms? Let's start with that question and think about how we negotiate and what is the right way to think about AI. So really asking what AI should do rather than what it can do. So So our vision on this was the question we were trying to answer or address in our institute is this idea of how to promote deep conceptual learning through these rich socio-collaborative experiences for all students. So we know that social collaboration is one of the most effective ways to learn, not the only, but definitely an effective one. The challenge is it's hard for a teacher to do this in a classroom. Why? Because there's one teacher, you may have 8 or 9 student groups. Some of them may be doing really well, others may be struggling a little bit. What is the teacher to do? There's a kind of a lost opportunity. On the other hand, some groups are having amazing conversations. They are really excited about ideas, but this is just not on the radar of the teacher because she cannot be omnipresent. I taught a class with 106 undergrads 2 years ago, and I made it a point to do one collaborative experience in every class. And I have to tell you, it was exhausting just running around with like 50 groups. But at the other hand, it was like the opposite of what was happening before, you know, with me like talking, where the whole classroom would come alive. But it was really just difficult how to kind of orchestrate this classroom environment for collaboration. So we thought about how can AI and help with this. And in our thought, we looked at AI as this kind of social collaborative partner that works with students and teachers. And again, this is ideas are evolving as we're doing the design. But at the time, we thought about the AI just working with these small student groups, and it could have multiple kind of forms. It could be this disembodied voice. It could be this animated agent. It could be a little social robot. But what it's doing is it's listening in on the conversations. It's collaborating with the students. It could be a guide. It could be a peer. It could be finding connections between 2 different student groups' conversations. But importantly, it's really working with the teacher. It's entirely in the ecosystem of the teacher. So the AI doesn't really have much agency. It's providing information to the teacher to help her structure the class and organize the classroom or orchestrate the classroom as she sees fit. So that was kind of our vision that we're working towards. And at the same time, we also focused on AI education as our content unit because we felt that there's not been a lot of, this is not really reflected in a lot of curriculum, even though there's been some kind of initiatives there. So developing curriculum materials that focus on AI and computational thinking, while at the same time promoting collaboration and some of these 21st century skills, critical thinking, while learning about the interaction of AI with ethics and society. So thinking about curriculum that are kind of broad to encompass multiple things. So the curriculum unit we're working on right now is called Sensor Immersion. It's on the concept of computers sense the world. So students have these little sensors that they learn how to program collaboratively to measure things around the environment. And that's kind of one example where they kind of diagnose what's going on. And lastly, we've kind of adopted this framework of responsible innovation in our research and development. And the idea here is to be very intentional about how we discuss and include AI in classrooms. And that starts by having conversations with students, their parents and teachers about what are their fears, what are their concerns, what are the opportunities they see in AI, and then having a design that's responsive to that. That's while also being reflective and adaptive. So we've just started these processes out. Just to, before I end, let me just play you a little bit of what our problem space is. Let me invite you into our problem space. What we have here are a student group, in a classroom, collaboratively learning the concept of diskiness, disk-like, what's a disk-like? And they have these objects, the soup can and this little spice thing and this Pam. And they got to do measurements and see what's a disk or not. And they're having this conversation, and this is kind of what it looks like. This is kind of like, if you may notice, these guys are kind of they may look disengaged, but they're actually thinking about some different ways to think about what's a disk by throwing out disk-like objects. The girls are taking careful measurements. There's a lot of noise and background noise. There's a lot of communication with each other, with objects, with the environment. And imagine an AI is trying to sit here and sort out something. So we definitely have our tasks, ahead of us, and it's quite intimidating. But the way we've been, but I think we've got a super team, and the way we've been approaching this problem is by thinking about our organizing our institute across these 3 research strands. So you have strand 3, which is really learning scientists, folks with expertise in co-design and education, really designing materials and making sure that we kind of have this and are diligently implementing this responsible innovation framework and how we're designing our AI. And then you have strand 1, which is really thinking about, these are the natural language processing, machine learning, computer vision people who are trying to understand how to understand conversations and facilitate them. And kind of connecting the two are the human-computer interaction people, people like myself, computer-supported collaborative learning, team science folks who are kind of trying to understand what's going on in teams and how can we support those with digital artifacts. And we've got a community hub that kind of unites the strands and also serves as this kind of external kind of force for the institute. Yeah, so it's been fun kind of getting this along, and it's been particularly fun, facilitating conversations between language people who, some of them actually have previously only worked in the kind of defense domain with folks in the learning sciences and kind of having those conversations. So exciting stuff. Let me just end by saying that the idea, I just gave you some examples, a few, of how some of these computational methods can provide some good opportunities to understand basic understanding of human functioning for really complicated things like teacher discourse, collaboration, mind wandering, and now making sense of complex social interactions in a classroom. And hopefully we can use these to both advance science as well as develop some technologies with a lot of limitations and caveats and things to consider. So let me just thank our lab and many people who worked with us over the years and funders and everything. So yeah, that's the current team. Thank you so much for your attention, and you can get more information on the AI Institute there, or feel free to email me.
So thanks, Sidney. I just wanted to start off by saying, so in the Measures of Effective Teaching project, we collected a bunch of video, and our purpose was to do like a very low-tech version of sort of what you're doing, in that we said, okay, we'll have this video and we'll have observers score it, and then we'll provide this. The scores will serve as sort of summary measures of what happened in the classroom, and we'll see whether those measures are predictive of anything, and whether those kind of data might be useful for teachers later. But in the process of doing that project, teachers kept telling us, remember, we collected the video just because we didn't have the money to pay for 5 different observers to go into each of 3,000 teachers' classrooms. But that's the reason why we collected the video. But teachers kept telling us, wow, just being able to see that video was the most valuable professional development I've ever gotten. And I wondered whether there was something really important in that what we were doing and what you're doing here is trying to take a super complex set of interactions, trying to boil them down to a few dimensions, text, the nature of the questions that you're asking, or students' mind wandering, or things like that. But what we're teachers saying is, wait, I'm a human. I can interpret that data. Just give it to me. Just give me the big pile of data. Give me the video and let me see it. And so and the trick there is how do you make that activity of seeing that, letting teachers see that big, messy stuff? How do you make that, rather than trying to boil it down to a few dimensions, how do you try to make the process of observing the full data set, the full video, more productive and more useful? for teachers. See what I mean? Like it's a different way of framing the problem as like, okay, let's try to figure out a way to boil these data down. And instead it's more like, how do we make it easier for teachers to process this full data set? Because they're going to be better at discerning their own students, mind wandering better than any of these instruments we could put together.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think they're kind of in, I think they're quite parallel actually. So a couple of things here. When we show teachers feedback, right, on these points, you know what they always say? I want to see my own data. That's the first thing, right? And then the question is, okay, well, here's your audio file. And then they don't look at it. And the point is that one of the things we're looking at now is actually using these measurements as a starting point to identify interesting examples and then show teachers their own data. So you can imagine taking 5 minutes or 3 minutes off their video and then showing that to the teachers. And that's exactly what we're looking to do. And we just started with this idea of just giving them some feedback dimensions. And there's actually a problem also, by the way, of boiling it down to these numbers that you very astutely pointed out to. If I give you a number, you can game the number, done. You can ask authentic questions without really changing the way you're teaching. And that's not what we want, right? We want you to change from maybe being more lecture focused to more discursive. So yes, so I totally agree that these are indicators of something that might be used in different ways. And we're just starting to learn how best to use them.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things is nobody likes to watch themselves.
Oh, no.
It's painful. On the other hand, the whole point is to get people to notice things they didn't notice the first time. And the best way to do that is to show it to them.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. Other folks with questions? Peter.
Yeah, thank you. I wanted to build on Tom's question. Is there a way to somehow iteratively use both the teacher's perception of their performance, but then also what the AI spits out to kind of learn, right? Another example could be in terms of evaluations. Oftentimes you'll have external evaluators evaluating teacher performances, and maybe are there ways that we can say how do different people pick out of this different things, and how's that a function of who they are versus what things are fixed attributes that we all commonly value to. And so that may be another way to get around this issue of folks don't like to watch their own stuff, but maybe we like to criticize other people's stuff or make comments about other people's work too. So that's just a thought.
No, thank you. Actually, yeah, it's a really good thought, and one that we haven't really thought about. So one thing that occurs is that to the question of perception of accuracy, right? We have been collecting data on that, and teachers, we've been surprised. We've been giving them the numbers, and they've really been forgiving with the numbers, maybe because we've been transparent with them. And we thought they would look at some of these numbers and just, don't believe in the whole thing. But what we've been thinking about doing now is just also to Tom's point, is trying to see if showing them the numbers and examples will actually see if they trust and believe in the numbers a little more. We're going to do that with the next set of teacher interviews. But to your deeper point, one of the things I mentioned earlier is that the models require some kind of annotation or some kind of human evaluation that this is what I think is this, but it doesn't have to be restricted to one set or one focal set. So you can actually have one set of people looking at it from this perspective and another from this, and it would be really interesting to see how we may combine those together in intelligent ways. So that's a great idea, Peter. Thank you.
One thing, Sidney, so we did a study after that project called the Best Foot Forward project, and where we were trying to act on this idea of showing teachers their videos, and can you does that produce behavior change? And one thing that one problem that I think we did solve was like, how do we get people over the hump of watching their own video? And we did solve that. Actually, the average participant recorded and viewed like 13, lessons over the course of a year. And the way we did that was we said, okay, well, we'll let you submit these rather than for your classroom observation, rather than have, your principal just walk in on you and observe. But we didn't get, any change in student outcomes or student reported nature of what was happening. So we were missing some other parts. And I wonder if what you were saying before about like pointing people to, giving people opportunity to try to move some measures that they can see within the course of their
and also I think the other missing piece is coaching. So sometimes you just need some kind of coaching to just help guide you, and I think that's the other piece here, that teaching is so much of a social interaction community, those.
Other questions?
Zach?
So Ola, why don't you ask your question out loud? Is Ola? Yeah, Ola's here.
Yes, sorry. So yeah, I was curious, in the PIER study, what exactly are you looking at in terms of physiology for engagement? What are you?
Thank you. So I'm collaborating with my colleague Leanne Hirschfield, who is an FNIRS expert and also from the Boston area. So basically, we're actually doing high density FNIRS. We are looking at, we scoured the reading literature to figure out certain networks we wanted to target, like the extended language network and so on. And we're essentially looking at kind of right now at essentially kind of activations at certain areas that have been linked in the scanner, in the more fMRI scanner, to certain reading processes as starting points to just validate the use of this technology. Then will be after that, we are trying to do simple things like saying, are there certain, we already know that the default mode network is active, for example, when you're mind wandering, right? When most of that is much deeper, in the cortex, than the cortex. So basically saying which of the shallow correlates can we also pick up. So at this point, it's very preliminary, kind of almost validating the methodology compared to high quality scanning in the scanner.
Okay, so Zach.
Sidney, building on some of the earlier questions, I'm curious if you know about any work where people have used NLP techniques to identify like critical parts of interactions within video. So for instance, in thinking about getting teachers to engage more with video, well, say I'm a teacher and I record myself all day. Well, I just taught all day and then I got to go home and I have to lesson plan, etc. I'm not going to watch all these hours of video. But if I have a tool that says like, hey, these are the 3 like 4-minute snippets that you should review from today and think about and maybe talk with your coach about or whatever. Like, this is how a lot of chess tutoring programs work, right? You're not going to review your whole game, but they'll be like, you should look at this position where you made a bad move and you should think about that. Is anybody working on something like that?
It's a great question. Actually, we're working on it, but not in the case of the teacher stuff. We're working on it in the case of the, we're doing very quickly, in the teacher things, we're doing 2 things. I didn't talk about this today, but we also have models that basically segment an entire class session into these 30-second chunks that basically say, this was lecture, this was small group work, this was group, da-da-da-da. So that gives you a lot of context on when we want to focus on discourse. We want to focus on discourse when the teachers are, doing discussion or there's some kind of thing. So that's at least one way to narrow down the entire thing to some elements. And that you can just get from audio. You don't even need anything much for that. The work that I think that the next point is what are the interesting points, right? There's work in automatic highlight detection in sports, actually, from the 80s, where they were really interested in that question. And what they were doing there was trying to figure out what are the key moments in this talk in the sports game to draw attention to look for highlights. And I know there's also work in automatic detection in YouTube videos. Where there's concerns about video. This was during the kind of ISIS was using YouTube very effectively, propaganda videos, trying to identify what are the points in the videos that are more likely to have this kind of uptake and things like that. So there's some stuff out there, but like everything, it's very domain specific, I would imagine. But I think those two things can give you some general thoughts. We're doing this in our collaborative work because, again, what everybody's telling us, we want to see our videos of collaboration. And so we're trying to figure out how to find snippets to give them that they may find interesting.
That's the, don't try to boil the ocean. That's the try to turn the ocean into cups like problem, you know.
Exactly. Well put.
Yeah. So, and it'd be interesting to see whether like 4-minute sections of any class just chosen at random would be just as effective as, like, you know,
exactly,
trying to be very precise about finding the turning points.
Exactly.
So Julia, you asked a very interesting question in the chat. Do you want to just ask live? Is Julia still here?
She had to run, actually.
Okay.
She wasn't available today, but I'll make sure to copy and paste it to share it with Sidney too.
Okay. Other questions people might have? We're getting close to time.
Yeah, I would say maybe 2 minutes before we transition at the max.
All right. Any more questions, or should we?
I guess I also just wanted to highlight that some of this work on classroom observation and coaching and like the video library makes me think of the MQI coaching project, where it's looking at math lessons, but they have they have tons of video on the classroom. They've broken it down into segments and coding. They have coaches that take one of like the teacher's segments, and then they have an exemplar video that they compare it to. They identify like, here's a couple of actionable items you can do next time, and like kind of follow up. And it's a really interesting cycle that they've gotten a lot of really great, I'll say, anecdotal feedback on. I don't remember any of the official outcomes off the top of my head, but that's another project at CPIER that just makes me think of all of those similar pieces. And it looks like, do we have another question from Ola?
Yes, sorry, another question. This is more of a technical question. So how much data is enough data to train some of the models? So like, what is, I guess, the minimum amount of conversational data do you need, like in terms of hours? This is just for something that we're thinking about. But.
Yeah, actually, I can send you a paper where we measured this for the teacher discourse. We tried out these deeper learning methods versus more shallower learning methods for different samples of data sets, and they do crossover at some point. I think the problems are not about data, it's about the positive examples of the cases you want, right? So authentic questions typically turn out to be 5% of the utterances in a data set. So I think making sure that there's enough examples, even if the data itself is good variability, is the key point, is a key thing. So for some of these categories.
Thank you very much. And follow up to ask for that.
Okay, definitely, yeah. Okay,
well, anyway, I just want to please join me in thanking Sidney for joining us today. I'm sure I certainly have, you know, this talk has made me think in about ways in which, you know, we might be collecting additional data beyond just, you know, test scores and you know, student background characteristics and interventions, and instead trying to instrument some other things. So it's sort of an eye-opening presentation that I'm sure many of us will be thinking about long after today. So thank you, Sidney, for presenting, and thanks everybody. We'll be reconvening the PIER seminar back in the new semester. Our next speaker will be Barbara Biasi from Yale. So thank you, and see you all in the new